In this video, I present what I think are the 5 most important things for you to know about the Acts of the Apostles, the first book in the New Testament after the Gospels. We'll begin with number 5 and work our way down to number 1. Number 5. Acts is a companion volume to the Gospel of Luke that continues the story after the ascension of Jesus at the end of the Gospel. In the top 5 on Luke, I noted that the Gospel has a sequel, and this is it, the Acts of the Apostles. Recall that the very beginning of Luke is addressed to a person, and likely a real person, Luke's first reader, who is named Theophilus. Theophilus shows up again at the beginning of Acts. The author reminds Theophilus the material that was covered in the first book, which we call the Gospel of Luke, all the things that Jesus did and taught up to the time that he ascended into heaven. Acts chapter 1 actually then rewinds the narrative clock, providing the instructions that Jesus gave to the disciples in Jerusalem after he was resurrected before re-narrating Jesus' ascension in Acts chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. The connections between Luke 1 and Acts 1, which are commonly called their prefaces, as well as the narrative, thematic, and stylistic similarities between these two texts, lead nearly all scholars to believe that they share a narrative unity, which is called Luke Acts, and that they were written by the same author. As we talked about in the top 5 on Luke, the traditional view is that the author of both of these texts is Luke, who is a traveling companion of Paul. Luke is mentioned in several Pauline letters and is identified as a physician or doctor in Colossians chapter 4. Acts allows us to glean a little bit more information about this author and how they operate, whether or not Luke is the proper designation. So as we've said, the author of Acts appears to have been a traveling companion and ministry partner of Paul. There are 4 sections in the second half of Acts, which is all about Paul's travels, where the author shifts from the third person, he, she, they did this, that, and the other, to the first person plural, we did this, that, and the other. This is exemplified here by Acts chapter 16. We set sail from Troas. We remained in the city. We sat down and spoke with the women. Most New Testament scholars think that the author is being autobiographical in this and the other we sections, indicating that they actually did travel with Paul. The other things that Acts allows us to glean about the author, which some of these are hinted at in Luke but come out more prominently in the second volume, is that the author is a fairly careful historian. Not only do they narrate the accounts of real, important, and verifiable figures from the early church, but they also mention real, important, and verifiable political figures from the Roman period. The author also seems to have a pretty good understanding of Roman law, as they present multiple different trials in the book. Finally, and related to those we sections, the author also appears to have good knowledge of Mediterranean sailing routes and practices. And perhaps this is because they really did accompany Paul on several different sea voyages. Number 4. Acts is a historical novel that was written with several different purposes. While Luke and Acts form a narrative unity and were almost certainly written by the same author, they are not exactly the same genre. We, of course, now call Luke a gospel, but remember that this term was not a literary designation until after the Gospels were written, and Mark is the only gospel that calls itself a gospel. As far as ancient genres go, biography is the closest match to Luke as well as the other Gospels. But Acts is not a biography. It doesn't focus on one single individual, narrate the important events, deeds, and virtues of their life, and attempt to get its audience to think certain things about this central figure as the ancient biographies do. Instead, Acts tells a number of different stories that are focused around a cast of characters. Acts also contains a lot more drama, trials, shipwreck, and murders, and even some humor, preaching, putting people to sleep, and non-Christian exorcists trying to ride the coattails of miracle workers just to make a buck. All of this stuff, the drama and the humor, doesn't show up so much in the Gospels. In this way, Acts resembles ancient novels or novellas, of which many still exist. But Acts also differs from these novels insofar as it's not pure fiction. Acts contains a heavy dose of history or historiography. This was also a common ancient genre that was sometimes directly aligned with biographies. So you might have a biography of a famous person in one work written by an author, with a follow-up work that presented the influence of that person after they died. The historiographies would outline the events and virtues of the movement, nation, or group, which aligned with the famous person that was mentioned in the biography. This appears to be what we have with Acts, a sort of historiography that follows up on a biography, but also contains a dose of novelistic elements. This means that Acts is probably best understood as a composite or mixed genre. And a variety of purposes for this mixed genre of Acts have been proposed. Like the genre of Acts, it's probably best to think of multiple different purposes operating at the same time. As a history or a historiography, Acts means to tell the story and history of the early church, and it does so in a particular way. Some scholars think that Acts is attempting to make a place for the movement, to present it as politically innocuous, while others think it's actually meant to inspire movement that is somewhat politically subversive. Others think that Acts is trying to unify a church that's becoming increasingly diverse, made up of both Jewish and Gentile believers. Still others think that Acts is trying to bring new believers into the fold in an evangelistic sort of way, or explain why there are so many Gentiles that follow a risen Jewish Messiah. Number 3. Acts presents early Christianity as a movement that's inspired by the Holy Spirit that moves outward from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. Whether or not Acts has an evangelistic purpose, it clearly celebrates persons being added to the numbers of the Jesus movement and presents this movement as one that is inspired by the Holy Spirit and gains steam as it moves geographically from Jerusalem at its center out to the ends of the world, ultimately reaching the city of Rome by the end of the book, which leads us to number 2. The first half of Acts is set in the region of Judea and focuses on the ministry of Peter. Acts 1:8 presents the movement of the entire book and seems to indicate how the author imagines the spread of the early church to have occurred. This is where the narrative clock has been turned back and Jesus is present with the disciples in Jerusalem. Before he ascends to heaven, he tells them that they will receive the Holy Spirit, which foreshadows the events of Pentecost, which will be narrated shortly after in Acts. And they will be witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. This presents a threefold movement. It begins in Jerusalem, it spreads concentrically outward to the surrounding country of Judea, and then to the rest of the known world. In America, it might be akin to saying in Kansas, in the Midwest, and all the way to the seashores. It helps to visualize it on a map. Here we have the region of Jerusalem, which is a city in the region of Judea to the south and Samaria to the north. Notice Galilee even further to the north, where Jesus was operating. The first half or so of Acts all takes place in this area right here. And a lot of different stuff happens in that area right there. First, we have Matthias being added to the 12 disciples to replace Judas, and a small movement of men and women devoting themselves to prayer in Acts chapter 1. In Acts chapter 2, we then get the narration of Pentecost, or the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. In Acts chapters 3 and 4, Peter and John are healing and preaching in the temple and end up getting arrested. Additional signs and wonders, preaching in the temple, and the number of the disciples increasing greatly in the city of Jerusalem takes up the content of Acts chapters 4 through 7. Then in Acts chapter 8, we are introduced to Saul, who persecutes the church in Jerusalem and ultimately leads to its scattering further outward. So then in Acts chapter 8 and 9, we get this outward movement into Samaria and the wider regions that are still within striking distance of Judea. We have Philip going to Samaria. We have Peter and John confronting a magician in Samaria as well. Philip takes the road from Jerusalem to Gaza, and this is where he will convert the Ethiopian eunuch later on in Acts chapter 8. And then Saul's transformation occurs near Damascus, up further north, beyond what is actually shown on the screen here. once Paul joins the movement, things start to change dramatically and geographically, which leads us to number 1. Number 1. The second half of Acts introduces Paul and follows his missionary journeys outside of Judea. Paul is going to be a central figure in the second half, or really the second 2/3 of Acts, and he's also going to be a major figure in the New Testament as an author with 13 different texts that are attributed to him. Paul first appears as Saul in Acts chapter 7 and is an ardent persecutor of the Jesus movement. He has a transformation in Acts chapter 9, and in Acts chapters 9 through 12, the leaders of the movement, the Jesus movement, regroup in Jerusalem with Saul, who will come to be called Paul, and he is counted as one of their number. But whereas Jesus' original disciples and the characters that take up most of the beginning of Acts operated in and around Jerusalem and Judea, Paul is going to operate more widely geographically. Paul takes several journeys, which are called Paul's missionary journeys, and Acts presents 3 of them. The first is to the island of Cyprus and Southeast Asia in Acts chapters 13 and 14. The second, in Acts chapters 15 through 18, takes Paul through Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Achaia, which is in modern Greece. The third missionary journey follows a somewhat similar route to the second, and ultimately will bring Paul back to Jerusalem by Acts chapter 21. These missionary journeys, likely roughly representing Paul's actual historical travels, have the apostle traversing the then known world and helping to spread the movement abroad. Paul ends up in several important urban centers, largely presenting his gospel to Gentiles who join the movement and are able to worship the Jewish God through belief in the saving death and resurrection of Jesus. Ultimately, by the end of Acts, Paul is going to make it all the way to Rome, which represents the end of the earth for the author of Acts. Paul gets to Rome by way of Caesarea and Jerusalem because of his political troubles. At the end of Acts, we don't learn how things turn out for Paul. He's simply awaiting trial. In fact, the New Testament in its entirety is silent on Paul's fate. To piece together what might have happened to him, we're left to non-biblical sources and also early traditions from the early church about Paul.